There's a strange contradiction at the heart of this story. On one hand, an institution built on secrecy, discipline, and national security. On the other, a media brand built on provocation, visibility, and the selling of image. And somehow, in the public imagination, those two worlds are now being spoken about in the same breath. Not because of confirmed documents, not because of sworn testimony, but because of something far more volatile. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Suggestion: a whisper that travels faster than proof. A phrase that sounds official enough to feel dangerous. A headline that implies hidden files, sealed archives, and information the public was never meant to see. And right at the center of it all is a woman whose life has already been defined by scrutiny, by narrative warfare, by the uneasy collision between privacy and spectacle. What happens when the language of intelligence work, dossiers, leaks, sources, classified, is borrowed by the machinery of celebrity media? What happens when an adult entertainment brand's historical archives are suddenly framed as if they carry institutional weight? Is it journalism? Is it manipulation? Or is it something more subtle, a psychological operation conducted not by governments, but by headlines? The story matters now because it reveals how modern reputations are no longer shaped only by facts, but by the tone in which information is presented. The suggestion of authority can be as powerful as authority itself. A rumor wrapped in official language doesn't feel like gossip anymore. It feels like revelation. And that shift changes everything. For public figures, especially those already caught in polarizing narratives, it creates a new kind of vulnerability. Not scandal in the traditional sense, but something murkier. The sense that there is a hidden file somewhere, that a sealed folder exists, that unseen eyes have already reached conclusions. Whether or not that is true almost becomes secondary, because perception begins to do the work. You can feel it in the way online conversations harden, in how speculation becomes certainty, in how the phrase "according to sources" is accepted without anyone asking which sources, what standards, whose interests. And then comes the emotional layer. What does it feel like to watch your name circulate in a context that suggests surveillance, classification, and institutional judgment, even if none of it is substantiated? To be spoken about as though your life were an intelligence asset rather than a human story? Is outrage the right word? Or is it something colder than that? A sense of being stripped of narrative control? Because this isn't just about a magazine. And it isn't really about intelligence agencies either. It's about how power is performed in the information age. How credibility can be implied without being earned. How the architecture of secrecy is used to give weight to stories that may rest on nothing more than curated imagery and strategic ambiguity. And once that architecture is in place, once the audience has been trained to imagine locked cabinets and redacted pages, it becomes almost impossible to unsee them, even when they may not exist. But the most unsettling part isn't the rumor itself. It's what comes next. Because when institutions known for silence are rhetorically placed into the same narrative as institutions built on exposure, the collision doesn't just generate headlines. It generates belief. And belief, once planted, has a way of growing on its own, quietly, relentlessly, until it begins to shape how every new piece of information is interpreted. And the next phase of this story hinges on one question. Who benefits when the language of secrecy is used to sell a story that thrives on visibility? Because what surfaced after these initial whispers didn't clarify anything. It deepened the fog. And in that fog, a new set of implications began to take shape. Ones that would pull this narrative into far more uncomfortable territory. The first thing that should raise eyebrows is how quickly authority gets implied without ever being demonstrated. Notice the phrasing. Sources, files, archives. None of these words confirm anything on their own. But when they appear together, especially alongside institutions associated with secrecy or cultural influence, they trigger something automatic in the audience. A reflex. We've been trained to read those words as signals, as markers of legitimacy. And that's where this story quietly shifts from rumor to something more dangerous. Because no document is shown. No provenance is established. No chain of custody is explained. Instead, the narrative relies on proximity. If you place a name next to an institution long enough, the audience begins to assume a relationship exists. It's not said outright. It doesn't have to be. The implication does the work. This is not a new tactic, but it's rarely been this effective. Ask yourself this. When you hear that an intelligence-linked term is attached to a celebrity narrative, do you instinctively slow down and demand evidence? Or do you lean in? Most people lean in. And that's the point. What makes this particular moment different is the way two very different reputational machines are being blended. One trades in silence and mystique. The other trades in visibility and provocation. Alone, each has a clear cultural role. Together, they create confusion, and confusion is fertile ground. Because confusion invites interpretation. Some people interpret the story as confirmation of long-held suspicions. Others see it as an attack. But almost no one asks the most important question. Why now? Why does this narrative surface at a time when public attention is already fragmented, when trust in institutions is low, and when outrage travels faster than verification? That timing matters. And so does the emotional framing. The story isn't being pushed as a discovery. It's being pushed as an exposure. There's a subtle difference, but it's crucial. Discovery suggests process. Exposure suggests revelation, something hidden being dragged into light. But what if nothing new was uncovered at all? What if the only thing that changed was the language used to describe already public material? This is where things get uncomfortable. Because if that's the case, then the power of the story doesn't come from information. It comes from framing. From borrowing the gravity of intelligence culture to retroactively elevate material that never carried that weight on its own. And once that framing takes hold, it reshapes how audiences read the past. Old images start to feel like evidence. Archived appearances feel like files. Public record begins to masquerade as classified insight. That transformation doesn't require coordination. It requires repetition. And repetition is everywhere. You can see it in thumbnails, in clipped headlines, in the way commentary videos lower their voices, as if discussing something forbidden, even when nothing forbidden is actually being shown. The real tension here isn't about what exists. It's about what people are encouraged to imagine exists. A folder, a report, a judgment rendered somewhere out of view. And once that imagined object forms in the public mind, it becomes immune to correction. Because how do you disprove a thing that was never clearly defined? You can deny documents. You can clarify timelines. But you can't easily erase a feeling, especially the feeling that something is being withheld. And that's where this chapter ends on an uneasy note. Because as this narrative spread, it didn't slow down. It didn't solidify into facts. It fractured, splintered into interpretations, each more confident than the last. And just as the audience was being trained to accept implication as evidence, a second layer entered the story, one that shifted the focus away from institutions entirely and placed the spotlight somewhere far more personal. Here's where the tone subtly changes. Up to this point, the story has lived in abstractions, institutions, language, implication. But narratives like this don't gain real traction until they find a human surface to press against. And when they do, the pressure becomes personal very quickly. Because suddenly, the conversation stops being about systems and starts being about character. You can see the pivot almost in real time. The language shifts from sources say to this tells us something about who she really is. That's not accidental. That's escalation. The moment when an audience is invited to move from curiosity to judgment. And that's a dangerous step. What's striking is how little new information is required for that leap to happen. The same public moments, the same images, the same interviews that have existed for years are now being reread through a different emotional filter. Not as media artifacts, but as clues. Clues to what exactly? That's never fully stated. And again, it doesn't need to be. Ambiguity does the work. Ask yourself this. When people begin to say someone isn't used to something, scrutiny, restraint, limits, what are they really suggesting? It's not about behavior in a specific moment. It's about identity, about disposition, about an implied mismatch between a person and the rules they're supposedly encountering. That implication carries weight, especially when it's framed as resistance rather than reaction. Instead of asking how someone might feel being discussed in quasi-institutional terms, the narrative flips the emotional burden. It implies discomfort equals guilt. Anger equals exposure. Silence equals confirmation. It's a closed loop. And once that loop is established, Every response becomes evidence. Push back, and it's framed as deflection. Say nothing, and it's framed as quiet panic. There's no neutral ground left. This is where irony creeps in. A woman who has spent years being criticized for controlling her image is suddenly being portrayed as unable to handle loss of control, not because anything concrete has happened, but because the idea of oversight has been floated. The mere suggestion of unseen judgment becomes the story, and the audience is invited to imagine her reaction, not witness it. Imagine it. That distinction matters, because imagination is far more malleable than fact. It absorbs bias. It amplifies pre-existing beliefs, and it fills gaps with emotion. Is she angry? Defensive? Afraid? The story doesn't answer. It hints, and the comments do the rest. What's unsettling is how quickly speculation about emotional states is treated as analysis, as if tone could be diagnosed from headlines, as if interior reactions were public property once a narrative reaches sufficient volume. This is where the exposé structure reveals its sharpest edge, not in what it shows, but in what it invites the audience to assume. And all of this unfolds while the original premise, the supposed gravity of institutional involvement, quietly fades into the background. It becomes less important whether any file exists. The emotional portrait has taken center stage, which raises a question that almost no one is asking out loud. If the institutions were the hook, and the individual is now the target, was that always the plan? Because as attention shifted away from abstract authority and onto personal response, a new set of voices began to dominate the narrative. Voices far less restrained, far more willing to push the implications further than any headline ever could. And once those voices took over, the story crossed a line that can't easily be uncrossed. Because the next phase doesn't rely on implication anymore. It relies on amplification. And that's where things begin to spiral. Amplification changes the rules. Once a narrative leaves the hands of those who carefully imply and enters the mouths of those who openly speculate, restraint disappears almost overnight. The guardrails fall away. What was once suggestion hardens into assertion, not because new facts emerged, but because repetition creates confidence. You can track the moment it happens. The phrasing gets bolder. The pauses disappear. The allegedly fades out of the sentence entirely. And suddenly, the story isn't being discussed as a question anymore. It's being performed as an answer. This is where the mechanics of modern outrage fully kick in. Commentary feeds commentary. Reaction videos react to reactions. Each layer moves one step further away from the original uncertainty, but speaks with more authority than the last. It feels backward, but it's how the system works. What's especially revealing is how quickly the narrative begins to reward escalation. The calm voices lose oxygen. The measured takes disappear into the algorithmic noise. What rises instead are the voices willing to say the quiet part out loud, even if the quiet part was never substantiated to begin with. And the audience feels it. There's a sense of momentum now, a feeling that the story is breaking, even though nothing new has broken at all. The urgency is manufactured, but it's convincing, because urgency doesn't require facts. It requires emotion. And emotion is everywhere. Anger framed as righteousness. Mockery framed as truth-telling. Certainty framed as courage. This is the stage where reputations don't just get questioned, they get rewritten. Past actions are retrofitted to fit the narrative arc. Neutral moments are reinterpreted as foreshadowing. Silence becomes suspicious. Visibility becomes exhibition. There is no behavior that can't be bent to support the story once amplification takes over. And here's the uncomfortable part. At this stage, it almost doesn't matter whether the original premise was sound. The narrative has outgrown its origin. It now sustains itself on engagement alone. The more people react, the more real it feels. Ask yourself, how many people sharing the story could actually tell you what the initial claim was? Very few. They can tell you how it made them feel. They can tell you what they think it proves. But the foundation? That's already blurred. This is where the power imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Because an individual, no matter how famous, cannot correct a narrative that no longer depends on accuracy. You can't rebut a mood. You can't fact-check a vibe. And the louder the noise gets, the more dangerous it becomes to intervene. Any attempt to slow the story down is framed as panic. Any call for nuance is dismissed as complicity. So the spiral tightens. And just when it seems like the narrative has reached its loudest point, something interesting happens. The focus shifts again, away from the individual, away from the outrage, back to the institutions, not to verify their involvement, but to use their perceived silence as fuel. Because silence, in this phase, is no longer neutral. It's treated as validation. And that's the pivot that changes everything. Because when absence is interpreted as confirmation, the story no longer needs sources at all. And that's where the final act begins. Because the question stops being, is this true? And becomes something far more unsettling. What happens when belief no longer requires proof? There's a moment in every story like this where the noise peaks, and then, almost imperceptibly, something else takes over. Not outrage, not certainty, belief. Belief doesn't need documents. It doesn't need confirmation. It doesn't even need consistency. It only needs enough repetition to feel familiar, enough authority-adjacent language to feel credible, and enough emotional charge to feel justified. That's where this narrative ultimately lands. Not on proof, but on posture. Because if you strip everything back, the phrasing, the thumbnails, the insinuations, what remains is not evidence of hidden files or institutional judgments. What remains is a case study in how power is performed in the information age. How the suggestion of secrecy can carry more weight than secrecy itself. How silence can be read as confirmation even when it means nothing at all. And that should give us pause. Not because of who the story is about, but because of how easily the machinery turned. How quickly implication became assumption.